Welcome to the ChickenBytes podcast series, in which we unpack the issues currently facing the South African poultry industry. In today's discussion, Executive Director Chris Hattingh from the Centre for Risk Analysis joins us to weigh in on the impact of Trump's return on bilateral relations and South Africa. Thank you and welcome, Chris. Given the upcoming expiration of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, or AGOA, in 2025, what are your thoughts on its renewal and its significance for South Africa?
So in terms of its renewal, I think it's a fairly low pain or low stress threshold for it to be renewed. So what I mean by that is, versus some other bilateral trade agreements in which the US engage with other countries, something like AGOA is easier to renew, and it's easier relatively for countries to gain access or to be part of the agreement. So in terms of it being renewed, unless a country almost goes out of its way to implement policies that threaten its AGOA eligibility, or engages in actions that US lawmakers will perceive as against US interests, renewal is almost a slam dunk case for many countries in many cases. In terms of the importance for South Africa, I think it's a bit more concentrated, so it could be wider used and better utilized. But if you look at sectors like automotive, if you look at some areas in agriculture, for citrus, for nuts, for wines, I think there's importance in some sectors. So it won't be the end of the world if it isn't renewed for South Africa, but it also doesn't send the right sort of signal in terms of our other international relations, trade agreements, etc. It sends a signal that maybe South Africa is not that desirable for the US, for US markets, for US consumers. It potentially will affect future trade agreements with other countries, just in terms of sentiment and the sort of attitude towards South Africa. I think should South Africa's participation be renewed, that sends a good signal, a more substantial signal that would also help cut through some of the noise that we inevitably will see in a second Trump administration.
In a recent CRA risk alert publication, it was stated that South Africa is at particular risk in the second Trump era because it has already attracted the unfavorable bipartisan attention of Congress. Can you expand on this?
Right. So the biggest focal point was a review implemented and put forward by both Republican and Democrat Congress people over the last two or so years, to conduct a review of complete review of US-South Africa bilateral relations. So that will include things like AGOA, but it's also other areas of cooperation and engagement. So concerns on the part of those Congress people in terms of some of the conduct and noise that South Africa has made over the last 3 to 4 years, especially. So if one looks at the Russian invasion of Ukraine a couple of years ago, you look at South Africa not condemning that invasion in the United Nations, for example. You look at South Africa taking Israel to the International Court of Justice following Israel's actions in Palestine. And for the US, Israel arguably one of their closest, if not their closest allies. So that to them is concerning. And then you look at South Africa conducting military drills and exercises with countries like China, Russia, Iran, that to US lawmakers and Congress people, to them gives concern about whether South Africa is truly neutral and non-aligned, and also whether South Africa is moving closer to some of those countries. I think the biggest concern on the part of the US is potential closeness between South Africa and Iran. I think there's a realization in terms of trade, just how important China is as one particular example. But there are questions, especially security questions for the US around South Africa's relationship with Iran and how that continues to develop and manifest. So that bilateral review, it still needs to pass through a few sort of barriers and committees in the US Congress. So that wasn't completed before the new administration will come in. We'll need to see if that is now shelved or if it continues to be pushed through. I think potentially what could be to South Africa's benefit is the US might focus more on domestic issues. Trump very much campaigned on bringing down inflation, bringing down prices, all that sort of stuff. So he needs to sort of focus more on domestic issues where possible. We'll see if that focus continues. And then maybe that means the US obviously doesn't completely retreat from international matters, but it doesn't focus so much on relatively smaller issues or concerns that South Africa, as an example, might present.
The Star recently published a different perspective in that some African leaders expect that Trump's administration could bring their countries more economic benefits and that Trump may loosen restrictions on the fossil fuel industry, potentially creating opportunities for African oil and gas producers. What are your sentiments around this?
Yeah, I think that's a very plausible argument. It's a very plausible case. That's also partly why I don't think you'll see noise and you'll see maybe more inflammatory rhetoric, but that doesn't mean it'll be followed with substantive actions on the part of the Trump administration around things like South Africa and some other countries. So for the US, the risk for them in terms of maybe taking more strident action is, of course, undermining their own interests and their own American companies' interests and growth for potential in places like South Africa and other African countries, sub-Saharan African countries, and also in that way pushing South Africa more into the sphere of influence of countries like China and Russia. So sort of unintended consequence in terms of how the US under Trump pursues its foreign policy and its geopolitical alignment. So I think that is a plausible case to put forward. Should the Trump administration be quite aligned internally and focused on what to them are important US security, economic, and geopolitical issues, they will adopt a more transactional foreign policy. And those countries that have a sort of stable government, that are aligned, that don't contradict each other. You don't have ministers contradicting each other from one day to the next when they engage with their international counterparts in the US and other Western countries. They will benefit. The US will take that more transactional win-win approach. It becomes more pragmatic, of course. So also then for countries that engage with the US on those terms, you also look to see what benefits they can gain from purely sort of bilateral trade agreements and those sorts of engagements.
What strategies could South Africa implement to strengthen trade relations with South Africa amidst the changing political landscape?
So I think South Africa has tried in the last, let's say, 3 years to regain or win what it would feel it should have in terms of sort of moral standing on the international stage. So things like the court case with Israel, trying to champion oppressed peoples and their plight and their issues around the world. I think South Africa should adopt a more pragmatic growth and investment-focused foreign policy and trade policy. So don't try and use trade or economics to pursue maybe more moral considerations. Use the right diplomatic and foreign policy channels for those. But when engaging with a country like the US, come with a clear understanding of what you bring to the table. That's not to be a supplicant or to be in a position of weakness, but come with a real confidence in the country in terms of what sectors are well developed, what are the challenges. Don't try and shy away from those and pretend everything is hunky-dory, everything is perfect, and present that plausible picture to the US government, to US companies, US investors. I think try and also talk up the potential of South Africa in terms of leading the implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Africa and South Africa could benefit a lot from the accelerated implementation of that trade agreement, as can US companies and US investment in the long term if it is implemented in the right sort of way. So there are many strong cards in South Africa's deck to play. It just again depends on whether departments like DIRCO, like the DTIC, the presidency, whether they can be truly aligned on what they focus on and talk about. Because if the signals become mixed and uncertain, that then opens up space for other countries, other governments to reach maybe conclusions that that would not be in South Africa's interest.
We know that South Africa imports the majority of its poultry from Brazil. Do you foresee any potential impacts in terms of our poultry imports or perhaps exports from South Africa?
I mean, if we're talking about the US specifically, we'll need to see domestically what sort of pressures and requests farmers and others put on the US administration, what requests, do they want more protectionism? Do they favor certain markets over others in terms of imports to the US? You could see, the use of increased tariffs as a pressure tool, or at least a threat of increased tariffs. So if for someone like Trump, if he sees the new BRICS alliance as a threat to US trade and US interests, he could then, for example, threaten higher tariffs on things like on products from countries like Brazil, South Africa, etc. So we'll need to see the details first in terms of how it manifests. There will be, I think, quite a bit more just uncertainty in that regard. So that demands that companies are 100% on top of issues. They're abreast of new developments. They have the data and the information that they need to shift their supply chains, their export targets or markets if that is needed. If we're entering a period of higher protectionism and higher tariffs, especially from a US point of view, that means that South Africa also needs to ensure its export markets are sufficiently and well diversified, and where we source imports from, of course, to be aware of if we're concentrated in a particular sector. So, for example, in poultry, it's relatively more concentrated from Brazil. What are the implications of that? Can we mitigate that if overnight, there's a massive new tariff from the US? Can we deal with that or not? And if not, why not? How can we account for it? Can we deal with it practically and pragmatically? Or does it require longer term investment? But I think, for the next 2 to 4 years, the sort of watchword is just more volatility and more uncertainty.
Thank you for joining us today on Chicken Bites, and we hope to have you on the next episode.